Representative, are there, the new benchmarks that you mentioned, Katie, are they listed somewhere on a separate document?
They were in the recommendations, probably
In
the
2019?
2018 recommendations. I pulled them and I put them in the text
In the
of
email.
the email that I sent you.
I did copy that out, thank
We
you.
should have all 5 of them together and put this down. Yep.
We are back. We have Deputy Commissioner Miranda Gray joining us, and she's going to walk us through a review of the benchmarks and numbers and where we're at. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. I might also be having Monica Medeiros, who is the Communications and Legislative Liaison for Economic Services, joining. So if you see her in a moment, looking to log in. I also just want to start with, I'm happy to provide numbers that I was able to gather today. I think this is normally housed in our Agency of Human Services. However, that position has been vacant for quite some time. So said that I was happy to bring you the information because we were able to find it. But just did want to nuance that I am certainly not the expert in all of this. So
We appreciate you stepping up.
Happy to. I am going to share so that way you're able to see. Sorry, it's just a little different than Teams. I think I did it. So I was asked to share where we were in 2016 through 2019 to the latest data for most of these data points is 2023. And so I'll just kind of run through these. You will see that really most of the data points have decreased. So the number of children living in families at 50% of the federal poverty level is now, I'm sorry, so I'm making sure, is at 4,000. The percentage of children living in families at 50% of the federal poverty level is 4%. It used to be at 8% in 2016 and 5% in 2019. Right, sorry, you aren't seeing all of the data points. I'm happy to share. It is on the NEEKC website if that is more helpful, but this is just kind of a snapshot. The number of children living at families at 100% of the federal poverty level is at 10,000 now in 2023. At 2016, it was at 17,000, and 2019 it was 11,000. The percentage of children living in families at 100% of the federal poverty level is at 9%. It was at 15% in 2016 and 10% in 2019. The number of children living in families at 200% of the federal poverty level is 28,000. That used to be 37,000 at 2016 and 33,000 in 2019. The percentage for the children of families living in 20% of the federal poverty level is at 25% now in 2023. In 2016, it was at 32%, and in 2019, it was at 30%. The number of children living in families paying more than 30% of their cash income for housing and related expenses. The latest data point we have for that is from 2022, and that's 29,000. That is down from 35,000 in 2016, but it is up from the 28,000 it was in 2019. For that same measure, the percentage of children living in families paying more than 30% of their cash. Same thing, we have that from 2022. It is at 25%, which is down from 2016, which is at 30%, but it is up from 2019 when it was at 24%. The number of children living in poverty according to the supplemental poverty measure, and this is a 3-year average. In 2023, it was 7,000, which is down from 12,000 in 2016 and 13,000, which it was in 2019. Same thing moving into that percentage of children living in poverty according to the supplemental poverty measure. In 2023, excuse me, it's at 6%, which is down from the 2016 when it was 10%, and in 2019 it was 11%. I'm getting to the last couple measures here. The number of children experiencing homelessness on any given night is 654 children in 2023, which is up from 257 in 2016 and 251 in 2019. The number of children whose parents lack secure employment, the latest date we have for that is 2022, and that's 29,000, which is down from the 32,000 in 2016 and 28, and is up from 28,000 in 2019. And to put that into percentage, it was 26% for 2022, which is down from the 27% it was in 2016, but up from the 25% it was in 2019. I believe those were all the data points that folks were hoping to receive.
Thanks so much. And if you're able, like you mentioned at the beginning, it would be great to see the full, I know some of the numbers aren't in that chart. It would be, it's hard to digest a lot of data, you know, being thrown. So yeah, I would love to see all those numbers so I can really think about them for a bit. So yeah, any questions? Senator Lyons?
Yeah, a quick question. It may not be a quick answer. I'm looking for the definition of what's included in the supplemental poverty measure. So what all goes into determining the numbers and the percentages that you have up there? Is that something that's included in the report that we'll see?
So I don't know that there is a report, but I'm happy to look into that for you, Senator Lyons, and get back to you because I'm not sure. I said that I'm just here presenting the data today, but don't necessarily have all of the background.
Okay, well, yeah, that would be helpful. Just so we know what the cumulative information includes, you know, to arrive at each number.
Sure.
Thank you.
So were you suggesting that we would get these documents? That they would be sent to us?
Yeah, or they get, you'll be able to find them on
The webpage.
webpage that Mike walked us through, and I can make sure they get emailed out as well to everyone. Great, thank you, Miranda. Anyone else have any questions? And if you're on Zoom, please just speak out because I can't necessarily see all of you.
Hi, yeah. Hi, this is Jenna. I have a question. Thanks,
Yeah.
Miranda. Thank you, Miranda, for presenting all this. I do have a question around the number of children experiencing homelessness on a given night.
Yeah,
What definition of homelessness was used to capture this number? Was it McKinney-Vento with information provided by schools, or was it a combination of that and the HUD definition where children would fall under their parents experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one that I will also need to take back to understand what this definition of homelessness is, because I'm not sure.
Thanks.
Jenna, this is Katie. I just want to say, really appreciate that question. I know we talked a lot last time the council was here about the different definitions of that. And so really looking forward to that information. And would be curious if it is the HUD definition, is there a way to get a number for the McKinney-Vento from the education side, or would that be something we couldn't get?
I think you could, and I think you probably could get both numbers. I just want to know if this was both numbers combined or separate. Thank you, Miranda.
for me, just something that strikes me as the other numbers look good. We're seeing, you know, less number families in poverty, yet we have this stark increase of children experiencing homelessness on a given night. And so how is that? Which has me thinking as we make our recommendations going forward. Okay.
I would agree. I think that, you know, Miranda, thanks for sharing the data, and, you know, it's a lot to try and digest in a single sitting and certainly in a single viewing, but immediately what jumps out is sort of the disconnect that started to happen between the measure of poverty and the measure of homelessness. And certainly that strikes me as an area where intervention strategies may differ from in the past, particularly the associating factors around cost of housing or other such inputs, where maybe poverty ends up not being the appropriate level for measuring the impact.
I agree. Perhaps we'll come up with new benchmarks to measure. Amy.
I'm curious about if Miranda has any ideas of what has been bringing the children poverty numbers down, and sort of the families that are left living in poverty, sort of what the barriers are of bringing it down further.
That's a great question. The overall, just because this isn't collectively what I oversee the Reach Up program. So I know we have some strategies there, but understanding there are a lot of people who are living in poverty who aren't necessarily engaged in programs that I see. I wouldn't want to misspeak, but happy again to see if there might be someone who can provide some more information for you there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Katie Ballard. I know that with schools doing universal free lunch, there's been less school districts filling out or having families fill out the paperwork for free and reduced lunch. And I know that that is sometimes how they track that poverty measure. So I would just be curious to know if when we get that person to come in who can kind of talk to us about that, if they might have a view on is the not filling out the forms, because we heard before the forms were really important. I'm just curious if since COVID and not filling out the forms, if that is making it harder to always identify some of those families who might be in poverty that might not be engaged with Reach Up specifically.
That's an excellent point, Katie. Thanks for bringing that up. Representative Austin.
Yeah, it's just interesting looking at the number of children whose parents lack secure employment hasn't really changed that drastically, but the children who are living or experiencing homelessness has increased dramatically.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to me because I just wonder if it has to do with a livable wage.
I suspect.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was where my head went as well. I think the rise of all the costs and wages not meeting that, rising in the same way.
Right.
Any other thoughts, discussion, questions?
I'm not sure if this would feed into it as well, and I apologize. I was not part of this commission in the past, and so this is new. This is sort of first time seeing this, but just based on other statewide conversations, maybe another data point to bring in. Certainly the livable wage would be on the demand side, and I do wonder about the supply side around housing as part of this discussion as well, whether that was strictly for affordable or just in general. And maybe getting some input from VHFA or other housing organizations who might be able to speak to that, sort of the maybe people who are technically out of poverty but still unable to afford those homes. So doing the supply side as well as the demand.
Thank you. If we have no more questions for Miranda, or Deputy Commissioner Gray, we'll let you go. You'll be back with us this afternoon. So we'll let you, I'm sure you have other work to do, though you're welcome to stay. And then we've got about 20 minutes before our next, before Natalie Foster will be joining us. So why don't we, Katie, do you want to ask your question again? That you had asked me during the break.
Sure. I was just asking, kind of trying to get a sense, and I apologize, I may not get the wording right, but I was just trying to get a sense of the kind of, are we continuing with the conversations from when the council was working together in the past years, or are we just kind of moving forward with these recommendations and kind of picking up from there? And just kind of wanting to understand that piece and updates as it kind of relates to some of those conversations.
Yeah, I think,
And just to add to that, because I think it's just a great idea, any legislation that's been passed that relates to the work of the council.
yeah.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. Just maybe looking at the reports and looking what we had advised, and then seeing if there had been any progress or legislation passed related to that. And then whether or not we want to continue to pursue some of those pieces, or obviously the housing and the employment is still pretty big and probably still in the crisis station, and figuring that out is a big thing. But there were, certainly other pieces in the reports that it would be great to get an update on those.
Okay, great. So I think what I will plan to do is have some time in our next meeting, once we schedule those, to look at the work of the council in prior years. I think, Katie, to your question, we'll probably have a little bit of both. Things are there's still all of the same issues, but we're also in a whole different world and landscape. So I think a lot of the same things that the council has worked on are still things we need to be working on. And to what Senator Lyons said, got to get back into my legislative mode. We've made progress. We, in some areas, would like childcare. So I think we should take some time to look at the prior work, see what we still want to continue working on, and then also assess the new challenges that exist in Vermont today for children and families.
One of the questions I have, and it's related to some of the questions the other members have mentioned, is just, how much did COVID or the flooding or that type of thing, play a role in the dramatic increase in the homelessness, especially of children?
Yes.
And where those, because clearly, the data looks like, unless we're not counting it completely, it looks like there's less children in poverty. But clearly there's more homeless, and that could have to do with, the availability of housing or the cost of housing increasing, but it'd be great to get a handle on that.
Yeah, especially as it seems so like an annual thing now, these once in 100 years, once in 500 years, how do we ensure that children and families can still thrive with these types of weather events?
And similarly to Amy's question, did any of those COVID stimulus payments or any of those other cash transfers to families help? Are those part of the positive trends?
Yes, and Natalie Foster, who's joining us, she works more on a national level, but I know she has a lot of data around how tax credits affect families. So yeah, definitely ask her. I got to speak to a college class with her yesterday at Middlebury College, and she's got a lot of data around how that works, and all sorts of rural and suburban and city centers. Okay, so are there any more discussion about this? Yes, go ahead.
I'm just, when I was reading through the benchmarks and the recommendations, I was just thinking, and I don't want to make more work for lead council, but for me, a spreadsheet, of the recommendations of the benchmarks, and then maybe not going through all from 2016, but just having columns of the data, you know, where the legislation is, what the implementation is of the legislation, where we are now currently. I mean, to get it really granular to a certain extent, so we can really focus our time and energy on where we have to, you know, pass legislation or take action. Because we really don't have a lot of time left. It may seem like we have a lot of time, but we don't in terms of implementation of it.
Go ahead, Katie.
In the past, we did put like a table together,
Mhm.
and it kind of marched through each of the recommendations. I can put that together. My work would be focused on legislation that has passed since the last time you met, because I'm not in the field and I can't
Yep.
tell you the implications of different policies or sort of maybe the very granular pieces you're looking for. So I could give you just a chart of, you know, a status update on legislation, and we could leave it there, or I could try to create it as maybe like a Google Doc, so people on the advisory council could have a column where they could also add their own input that is separate from legislation, but what's happening in the field. And then sort of like a group think exercise, and by the time we would come back for the next meeting, we would have a chart that has both the legislation piece and what's happening in the field.
So
Something like that.
we'd have the implementation piece, like where that legislation is being implemented, where we are.
I wouldn't be able to put
Yeah.
that piece in, but if there is somebody on the council who could answer those questions, or somebody on the administration who's sitting on the council and could fill that in, then yes, we would have that.
Okay.
How do folks like that? Oh, Senator Lyons.
Yeah, so we could get extremely granular in all of this. I mean, we could talk about numbers of divorces. We could talk about foster kids. We can talk about school counseling. We can get into just a number of different areas. Obviously, the big one, I agree with Seth. I think that housing is such a huge issue for us, and we've done a lot of work on that. That's important, as is income. That's also important, and we know that there are inflationary pressures that are sort of detracting from any increases in income, which is why I went to the supplemental poverty measures and thinking about what is it exactly that we're using to give our benchmarks. And so if we can have that itemized, that might help us narrow our thinking. So when we talk about poverty, it opens up the whole world, and so we want to be very discreet about our thinking. That's all. Just my comment there. And I do think having the recommendations that we've looked at in the past, as Katie and Sarita, Representative Austin, have discussed, are really great ideas.
I think as a council, we probably want to discuss, you know, what particular items we're going to look at, because, you know, the housing is at a crisis, but there's a lot of work being done on that, and we're not going to solve that on this committee necessarily. So maybe we want to think about, you know, the root pieces of poverty and how we can address that. And we can make recommendations, obviously, for housing, but maybe we want to talk about the wages or the Reach Up program, or, you know, or the basic needs and how that's meeting, or the economic programs that we have that maybe go to the root of income and affordability. Because I think, you know, the housing thing is so big, and there's people discussing that from a different perspective. So we might want to talk about, you know, what pieces that we can address.
Yeah. So I'm hearing a lot of interest in, you know, really tackling these poverty measures. Okay, Katie, work related, I was reading something something that actually really went into a lot of detail about the supplemental poverty measure and how you could tweak that to better capture what's really going on in a population. So I'll work with Katie and have something prepared for that for next week as well. Does this spreadsheet chart that Katie mentioned sound good to folks to see? To kind of complement the discussion of where we've been and where, so then we can think about where we want to go. Jenna.
I did. It was back to Karen's response. I think,
Yeah.
I just wanted to echo what Karen said, that a lot of people are working on housing and homelessness, but I do think that the council could elevate the concern and alarm that children are experiencing and the conditions that impact children who are experiencing homelessness in a different way that maybe other groups are looking to really think about homelessness and housing insecurity. Yeah. So I wouldn't want to have the council move too far away from that because that number is alarming.
As someone who's very involved in housing and homelessness, I agree. And I think we can do both. And there's a lot of really cool stuff around housing and families happening right now. I'm hoping we can get some people to talk in about the family supportive housing program and just how successful that's been. And I do think there are recommendations and that we can highlight as well. Okay, any final thoughts before we move on to it? Yes, Seth.
Yeah, and this might be an ignorant question due to sort of data suppression and everything else, but something else that might be helpful where available with the data would be geographic information, so that we could kind of take a look at it, because I would imagine that there's going to need to be some sort of regional specific intervention.
Yeah. Excellent point.
Are we able to break it down by age as well?
Yes, yeah, no, that's another geographical. To myself. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, well, we are, next up, we have Natalie Foster joining us. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. She is the president and co-founder of the Economic Security Project. She has been all over Vermont these past week, and we're very excited to have her join us as well today.
Thank you, Representative McGill. It is an honor to be here. Thank you. And thanks to you all for being here and being on Zoom. I have had such an extraordinary time in Vermont. This could not be the best. This is the best time to visit. For a Californian, I am over the moon. So I called home and said, I'm not coming home, except I actually have to, and I have to do it today. So I'm going to leave 10 minutes early before we, 10 minutes earlier than scheduled. I had the real honor of sitting with Representative McGill yesterday at Middlebury and hearing about so much of what you all have done in Vermont, and it's really inspiring to me. I think you're a leader on a very strong child tax credit, one of the most expansive in the country, on the childcare work that you've done to make childcare guaranteed and affordable for families, but also high wages and a good job for caregivers. It's all just so incredibly important. I also think, if we think about the name, right, we're the child poverty and strengthening families. And one of the ways I think we strengthen families is through economic resilience. There's a lot of talk of climate resilience. Like, we need a reliable grid in emergencies. Certainly what's going on with Asheville right now is something dear to our hearts. And I know something you all experience here in Vermont as well. We don't control when these things happen. And so we need resilience measures in place. So do Vermont families, right? They need economic resilience in place to weather the chaos of the moment in time that we are in, to weather the day-to-day crises that pop up for everyone, a transmission, stops working and you can't get to work, a childcare provider calls in sick. All of these are mini crises that families have to face, and they all require money and economic security to solve. And so I think creating a strong floor for families, which you are doing here in the state, is a really important part of economic resilience. And I think what you're doing in the state is actually part of a broader trend that is saying, the next American economy we build should be one that centers the inherent worth and dignity of every American, of every child and of every parent, regardless of their race, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their religion, that we all deserve that support. And we can prioritize stability. And through prioritizing that stability for families, we can unleash the abundance, the creativity, the ingenuity of this next generation, none of which gets unleashed if everyone is working 2 to 3 jobs to put a roof over their head or 2 to 3 jobs to put food on the table. So tax credits, childcare, the guarantees, right? Guaranteeing the basics for life is that make life, viable is something that I think is actually more possible in this country than it's ever been before. And nationally, there's a real sea change happening, right? Over the last several decades, there have been seeds planted around the country, in cities and in states. And when the pandemic hit, it was a once in a generation moment to move forward things that were seen as pie in the sky prior. So let me give the example of guaranteed income. About a decade ago, a young man sat in the Stanford Library reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And Dr. King was writing about the need for the racial justice movement to tackle economic justice, because there is no economic justice without racial justice. There is no racial justice without economic justice. And he was advocating for a guaranteed minimum income to abolish poverty in America. And then, of course, was killed. And so this young man was reading the book and taking notes in the margins, and his name was Michael Tubbs. He would move to Stockton, California, and become one of the youngest mayors in American history. And he decided to take on the idea of a guaranteed income. Okay, that's like in Stockton, it meant 125 families received $500 a month with no strings attached, just deposited into their account. If they got a promotion at work, they still got the check. If they got laid off from their job and had no income, they still got the check. It came in reliably every month on top of their wages and any other earnings that they had. And so he launched this program. People said, wow, that's a bold idea. And the media all came to Stockton. Another program launched in Jackson, Mississippi, by Dr. Aisha Yandaro, called the Magnolia Mothers Trust. This week, incidentally, Dr. Yandaro is on the cover of Time magazine as one of the Times 100 for her work on guaranteed income. And she centered race and gender, giving $1,000 a month to Black women in Jackson to support them having room to breathe in their life. And from these 2 pilots, it grew. It grew to 20 demonstrations around the country, to 90 demonstrations around the country, to now 160 demonstrations in rural, small towns, in big cities. Counties are now running huge demonstrations across 35 states. So this momentum was growing. And then the pandemic hit. And we had a moment to do something that differed from the last 50 years of economic policymaking. And we did. And one of the core things moved forward in the economic crisis that ensued the health crisis was the expanded child tax credit. And that was a guaranteed income for families, right? Weeks after Congress passed this legislation, the IRS was sending out checks to families debited into their accounts, no strings attached, no lines to stand in, no long forms to fill out, no proof of anything that you had to show or wait on hold for some sort of, agent to pick up the phone, none of it. money that came in to support parents in a moment of crisis. So we know how to do it, right? And that was incredible work speed. It was the beginning of a guarantee in this country. And it wasn't just checks, it was housing. We literally purchased hotels and moved the unhoused in, right? Giving people a room of their own with keys. We built more housing. We had a national eviction moratorium, never before, to keep people safe in their homes, getting us closer to a housing guarantee. That was a healthcare guarantee where we put vaccines for free. We mobilized the National Guard to administer them. We made healthcare free. We made tests free. And because we were able to expand Medicaid in this moment of crisis, as millions of people lost their jobs, it resulted in the lowest point of uninsured Americans in history in the midst of a crisis. And the child tax credit checks meant the lowest point, the child tax credit checks alongside the stimulus checks and the unemployment insurance support meant that we had the lowest point of poverty recorded of poverty in recorded history since we've been recording poverty, right? We cut child poverty in half. So we got closer to the guarantee economy, and I believe this is where we should orient our next 50 years of policymaking toward guaranteeing a floor for families to thrive. Not a ceiling. Families can reach as high as they want to go, but a floor through which no family can fall. And it's an honor to be here with you all in Vermont, in this state house that are pushing the bounds of what's possible with an expanded child tax credit on your books that not only goes to every, citizen in this state, but goes to everyone living in the state of Vermont who is working, who is buying goods. That is really breaking ground. And it's an honor to be with you all. We're pushing the bounds of what could be the Vermont guarantee, right? The guarantee that if you live in this state, there's a floor through which no one falls, which will mean kids who live here, young adults who live here can take a risk and start a business, can pursue a passion, can be creative and pursue a degree that they've wanted, right? The type of things that have made America great in the past and that we can unleash in the future. So it's an honor to be here with you, and thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Natalie. Are there any questions for Natalie or comments or things you want to know? Like I said, Natalie has studied these kinds of programs all over the country. Really has a wealth of knowledge. Senator Lyons.
Oh, thank you, Natalie. This is terrific. And your breadth of understanding across the country is really very helpful. The question is, for any of these programs, are there any federal dollars or a federal match? Understanding where we are in our appropriations and our budgetary world, sometimes it looks Herculean to do everything. Not that I would be against helping folks in this way. It would be helpful to know if any of these programs have received attention from the federal government, and if there are any grants or other federal dollars available to begin or to sustain this kind of work.
Yeah,
that'd be helpful.
That's a really great question, Senator, because that's going to be very important. As we all know, the federal government has very different budgeting than state houses have. And so the partnership to make an economic floor for American families is necessary. One of the things I would point to, just to sort of narrate a story, a few decades ago, Ai-jen Poo, the legendary organizer of caregivers, started organizing caregivers in New York. Women who work in informal settings, often Black and brown women, wages are incredibly low, and all kinds of rampant, wage theft happens in this informal setting of childcare providers. So she starts organizing childcare providers. It goes national. The National Domestic Workers Alliance is formed. Unions, start to not traditional unions, but associations of caregivers start popping up, and they start pushing for bills of rights. And then they start to organize with the families who are hiring the caregivers, for whom the affordability matters dramatically, for whom so much of the paycheck goes toward childcare. And you have this two sides that are both incredibly important, all of which believe, right, that it's in America, it's your own responsibility to sort this out. Like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, figure out how to make it work. And if you don't, well, you've done something wrong, right? Or you've made some sort of poor choice. But in fact, it is a deeply broken market that requires government support to make sure that it's affordable for families and that wages are high for caregivers. And so they come together and build the future of the care economy and argue that care is like infrastructure. It's like roads and bridges in America. It is not a personal responsibility. It's a societal responsibility, one that if we don't invest in, care is the work that makes work possible and has to be invested in as such. And so from that came a very different understanding of care. And I know that you've been on the forefront, Representative McGill and many others, pushing for guaranteed childcare in Vermont. And I understand that you were called to the White House this week to hear.
My committee chair was to DC. Yes.
Yeah, to hear about what you've done here, because it is a model. I also look at New Mexico, which just updated their constitution to make the guarantee of childcare something that every New Mexican gets. And so this is laying the seeds in the groundwork. And there's no way that you can fully do this without the federal government. And yet the federal government needs you pushing the bounds forward to understand what's possible. So I think of that as the laboratories of democracy and you showing what the future is. So I know that's not exactly your question. You're like, where's the checks? Where's the match? Let's do this. And I fully agree that is important to make these things happen.
Well, no, you're right. Obviously, you're speaking to the choir with this one. But it would be helpful to know if this program has reached the attention of anyone in the administration at the federal level. Our child care program, which we work very hard to pass, is a model across the country, and many of us are responsible for that, both in the House and the Senate. That's a huge step. What you're talking about is another step, which is different from Reach Up, not totally dissimilar, except there are no strings attached. The federal government doesn't work that way. We get that. However, sometimes, as you said, that perspective needs to change. And maybe we can, as you're looking across the country, have any of those programs initiated any change at all within the federal government for how funds might be allocated to the state without strings? We don't see that. You're absolutely right.
Well, we did see more of that during the pandemic, right? There was money that was moved that states allocated.
Now we're in recovery mode.
Yes. But so I think that on one side, we were in recovery mode. That made it more possible to do things. On the other hand, we did them. Things that were not seen as possible in the United States happened. So that means they can happen.
And they weren't.
And they weren't possible prior. Absolutely.
Representative Austin?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. There was a state, I don't know, in the West with a Navajo reservation. And this is what happened was a casino was built, and every month the families got money from the casino. So some researchers decided to follow the children that were getting this money. And the long-term outcome was, and I think it's been replicated, higher graduation rates, more employed, and healthier. So my question is, are we looking at the investment, of this, not just doing this, but how this could save us money? I mean, our health insurance, our healthcare is exploding. How could this hopefully, lower the cost of health insurance by making this early investment? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, or, I have data, to say, if we invest in this, we're going to save money in the long run.
Yes, I love that question because, specifically with guaranteed income, right, which are cash transfers, we often just see one side of the ledger, the money out the door. We need a whole new way of accounting that says when you invest in kids, right, here is the decrease in emergency room visits you get, right? Here is the increase in school attendance. Here is the increase in birth rates and birth weights, right? Both of which matter. All of this has been documented on from the data across both the reservations and the tribes that do cash transfers, as well as Alaska. The permanent fund in Alaska, which is capitalized through oil royalties. It's held in a commonly owned trust, and every year the Alaskan residents get a check, a dividend for their commonly owned wealth. The dividends go to increased heating, heating through the winter, which is important in Alaska. Alaska is very seasonal, so it allows for income stability through the entire 12 months of the year. And they also saw that things like birth weights went up. And then as we started doing this work in Stockton and in Jackson, we found another piece that I think is equally important, which is that the stress levels for parents went down, and for everyone who received the income went down. Literal cortisol levels went down. People reported being able to sleep better at night, to parent with a little more space and energy. The ability to even say yes to something like as extravagant as an $8 carton of raspberries in the grocery store meant the world to parents. I talked to a mom whose kids loved soccer. She was a Chicago based mom and one of the pilots in Chicago, which is run by the county. They used ARPA dollars as a $42 million pilot to residents around the county in Chicago, Cook County. And she talked about what it meant to be able to buy the full soccer kit at the beginning of the fall season of soccer, the shin guards, the uniform, all of it for her kid. It set up well, and she felt like she was able to provide for her kids. So there's a number of things that show up on the ledger on how people spend the money, in the sense of well-being, but then also in a more spiritual and psychological sense of feeling the agency and dignity of the stability.
You talk a bit about how these pilot projects are being funded. We don't have that kind of federal support yet. So how are these programs being funded in other places? And I do, so folks know, if they're not aware, Spectrum has in Burlington has been doing a pilot program. They'd had a private donor, and the numbers, the data has been amazing, just showing this is obviously Spectrum serves homeless and runaway youth, young adult. Well, they're mostly young adults, but they're putting money into young adults' pockets, and they're resolving their homelessness. They're figuring it out. They're getting jobs. They're going to school. So this is happening in Vermont, only on a very small scale. But I would, how are these projects happening?
Yeah, that's such a great question. In the very beginning, we were laughed out of rooms when we would sit down and talk about this idea. And we had to use private dollars only. That was in Stockton and in Jackson. So that was philanthropy. Philanthropy really serving as R&D for the future of the social contract, right? For research and development around a 21st century social contract. And as it moved on and became more legitimized, mayors started adopting it. There's now mayors who joined Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And they're all over the country. About half of them have pilots. And since the pandemic, we've seen most of the pilots coming online using public dollars. And so they are holding it up to the test, you know, are we seeing an ROI on these dollars? And the answer is resoundingly yes. So it's a mix of philanthropy and public dollars at this point. And we're starting to move beyond pilots, right? There's a number of actual policies that have moved forward. So there's a bill in California that would support youth exiting the foster system with a guaranteed income for a number of years. We know exactly who they are. We know that monthly cash transfers helps children. You know, the thing about cash transfers is that every month it's something different, right? One month it might be my transmission broke on the car and I need to fix it. The next month is like, I didn't get enough hours at my retail job and I actually need a bit more to make up my rent check. And cash is fungible in that way, which I think sits nicely with something like a baby bond, which I know you all are leading on in the state of Vermont. And we nationally couldn't be more excited to see what will come of Treasurer Pieciak's pilot and what you will do here in the state, because a baby bond is about wealth, right? There's income, it's regular, it's coming in, and then there's wealth. And they're two sides of a coin. I would say there's actually a third, which is wages. And we know for a long time, I talked to the mayor of Burlington last night, Mayor Mulvaney, Stanek, who talked about her work on the living wage campaigns, you know, a decade ago in Burlington. So wages are really important. We have to raise them. Income, passive income is really important, like tax credits. We need to pass them and make them incredibly eligible and that everybody who's eligible for them receives them. And then we need to think about wealth. And that is the cutting edge future. And that is what baby bond starts to get at. So all that to say, we're starting to see actual bills pass for specific communities, because I know that it's actually very expensive to imagine doing, you know, guaranteed income to every resident of Vermont, that it's not possible really with the state budgets. I get that. And so we're seeing the specific communities, people returning from prison, monthly cash transfers to support those coming out of prison, setting their life back up. Families on ITINs who work and pay taxes, but are often excluded from federal benefits. I understand that's different in Vermont. That's a population that can be supported through guaranteed income. So both the pilots and the legislation around communities. But there's a third piece, which is also administrative shifts to make it easier, less friction to send money and checks out the door. And for all of the different benefits to talk to one another, right? To coordinate. We know if somebody is eligible for the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit and Section 8 and a number of other things, we know that. So if people talk to one another, then it makes it easier for the recipient. And one of those places I'm very excited about is Direct File, where it's a slice of this, but just a quick note on that, you know, the IRS moved forward a pilot in 12 or 13 states. The pilot went beautifully, right? It's a free tax filing tool that the government rolled out. And I talked to a teacher who said, I set aside my whole Saturday to do my taxes, you know, to tell the government exactly how much I made, which they already know. So that's what I did on my Saturday. And she used the direct filing tool and it took her 30 minutes. But she got the whole day back, that teacher who deserves that Saturday. And so that's what I want for every American. Yesterday, the IRS announced that 23 states, so they doubled the number of states who are participating in this pilot. We'd be thrilled to see Vermont next to be the 24th state joining in. And that is the kind of administrative shift that makes it much easier to put cash with no strings attached into people's pockets.
Frank's had his hand up.
Oh, yes, of course.
Welcome, Frank. Do you want to just do an introduction before you ask your question, just because you'll miss the beginning?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, y'all. I apologize for being late. My name is Frank Knack. Pronouns are he and him, and I'm with the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. And really appreciate this presentation. I guess my question is following up on the question regarding kind of rethinking the ledger. it's if you've seen any states who have been kind of able to rethink the methodology for coming up with fiscal impact statements to kind of take into consideration the true cost of things, and the kind of the true cost savings, like you had talked about in terms of like, you know, reduced ER visits, et cetera, if you're actually funding root solutions. And if so, I guess that's a base question. And if not, like, is that something that anyone's thinking through? Just because I know, like in our own state fiscal statements, it's like very kind of traditional, not taking into account like true cost savings, and also like on the criminal legal side, the true kind of misspent dollars by using that system.
I think that is such a good question. I am not aware of a state doing it, but I do know that the scholarship of Dr. Hillary Hoynes at Cal at the University of California, Berkeley, she is a nationally renowned academic looking at tax credits and administration. And she is coming up with a way of budgeting that looks at the long-term impacts of making these investments in children. And so I really can't think of a better state to be pioneering this kind of budgeting than Vermont. So I'd be excited to work with you on that if that were something you wanted to take on. Okay, yeah, one more.
Do I need to introduce?
What?
Do I need to introduce this?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Calling my guest speaker here,
Okay.
the different Budget and Policy Center organizations.
Hi, Julie Lowell for the record, Public Assets Institute. It's not a financial impact statement, Frank, but one of the things that we can see in the budget is that during the pandemic, right, we had the economic impact payments coming into the state, we had the child tax credits coming into the state, and the expanded unemployment insurance. And so I'd be happy to share where you can see the direct impact in the state budget. And so what happened is all those dollars went right back into the economy, and you can see it in our revenues. And so you can see a big bump, not just in new federal revenues that came into the state, but our actual state revenues also increased dramatically during the pandemic. And so while we don't know like the 10-year projections of how much we're going to save, we've seen the evidence of the economic impacts. And of course, through our Housing First models, while again, it's a very specific program, we've seen like huge savings in healthcare dollars down the line from the Housing First programs.
Can you share that? Can you email it to Mike so he can share it out? Thank you so much. Lydia.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm curious, so given the university we do live in that has a whole bunch of means tested programs, I'm wondering what is sort of like the gold standard of having a guaranteed income that doesn't immediately offset those benefits, right? Like, is there a model that is ideal, or is it really just a medley of different programs kind of working within the universe? Or, we're not starting from a blank slate. We have these programs.
Yeah.
And we don't want people to lose their existing benefits.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very important point, that anything we do leaves people better off than they were. And one of the reasons to think about the tax code as a way of putting cash back into working families' pockets is because the tax code, tax credits don't count as income. They don't impact people's existing benefits. And so one of the things we've looked at is really expanding and modernizing the earned income tax credit as a way of putting money into people's pockets. I think one of the gold standards would be moving up the income to where, like, somewhere around half of the state would be eligible, so moving it up into the working middle income earners, teachers, firefighters, right? People who are middle class in the United States, and making sure certainly that those who are on the lowest income part of the spectrum are supported even more, can be sort of gradual in that way. I would argue paying it out monthly is a way that makes sure, there is stability for families, making sure everyone in the state is included, which you already do and have a model for, are really working out how to support all residents of the state. So a number of modernizations and expansions like that, Public Assets, I'm sure has bajillion white papers to do, are ways of approximating a guaranteed income using the existing pipes in a state. And just to say, I think of that as scaling what these pilots are doing, right? These pilots are demonstrating via philanthropy what it will look like, but it's up to the legislature to scale that into policy, and the tax code is a way to do it.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
So, today and last night you talked about, the pandemic, offered us, the opportunity to see some things. So somewhere when that happened, someone in the federal government, sat down, or people talked to them about what was going to be helpful to people, and they issued pandemic checks to people. They increased childcare, tax credits, rental assistance and things like that. They even issued money for small businesses and that type of thing, where they could get loans, and not even loans, grants. So at what point was that just because of the crisis, or does someone look at that information and say, well, these things really, really worked, and they would work for the long term if we had some way to continue them? We've continued some of the money that's going away in Vermont for certain things like child tax credit, that type of thing. But as a small state, we can't afford to continue all of them. So, how do you get that? Because someone made the decision to do those things at the federal level. But is someone now looking at that information in terms of long-term, what it did?
Yeah.
We looked at some numbers today, and it looked like, from when the child poverty was reduced from 12,000 to 7,000 in the state, but yet homeless is really up. So, how much of that was some of these programs from the pandemic that actually assisted families in a big way with cash assistance and that type of thing?
Sometimes it's not clear when you're living in the midst of history being made, just how important the things you're living in are and how they'll go down in history. I heard on Marketplace 2 days ago, a man talking about sitting behind LBJ, hearing LBJ talk about the Great Society, and he underlined it several times. I was like, that's a dumb phrase. And then it turned out, of course, that was an extraordinary moment in American history. And it's like he's living it and didn't quite realize it. And I really think that is what we as a nation are experiencing right now, that we have lived through an extraordinary moment of policymaking. And we are just beginning to understand the implications and what it meant for families to have this floor that the government built that allowed families the agency to weather the pandemic. And, things like small businesses being started. For decades, small business creation in America has gone down. It's a real problem if you believe small business are the engines of both economic growth and a functioning community and healthy community. And people are very vexed by this. And what do we do about it? Well, it turns out in the pandemic, when people had money in their pockets and were able to take a risk to quit a job for a few weeks and go start their own thing, that they did. And we saw small businesses go up by about 20%. For the last few years, that trend has persisted. And so that is just one example of the positive externalities of this guarantee, this policy making of guarantees that we are seeing. And so I think your question is just very important. Are we tracking this? Do we understand what it meant? And I think it's we're beginning to. But I also want to make sure that it's not too late, because one of the challenges of, also in your question, I heard, there was a moment people took advantage. And how did they sort of know what to move forward, right? And I really think that it is a combination of the researchers who wrote the white papers to crunch the numbers, to talk about how the policies could be made, like what Public Assets does in the state, as well as the organizing who built power amongst parents and children to say, this is what we need, like other groups do in the state, and as well as elected officials who believe that government does have a role because of their life stories, or because of just their ideology, but believe that government could be a force for good in people's lives. And so I really, just to put a finer point on it, don't have any doubt that when it was Michael Bennett from Colorado, Cory Booker from New Jersey, and Sherrod Brown from Ohio, who are the senators moving forward the expanded child tax credit. And I know that they were watching as mayors across the country were demonstrating what these checks would mean in people's lives. And it gave them the courage and the data to push that forward, along with all the academic research that had been done, to say this should be the centerpiece of the American Rescue Plan. And it was. And we cut child poverty overnight, reminding us that poverty is a policy choice in this country and we can make a different one.
Go ahead. Yeah, go Katie.
So I just want to say, as somebody who, I guess, technically, would be considered, especially during the pandemic, as having lived with my family in poverty. And so one of the challenges that myself and a lot of people in the disability community faced were not being able to leave, or being able to expose ourselves, or being able to access work safely for a lot longer. And those payments were definitely amazing, right? Being able to count on money and know not only can you catch up on your bills and make a plan to be able to catch up on your bills, but you might be able to also do just something a little special at that time for your kids, like maybe go and get the $25 popcorn deal at the movie theater, right? Like there's those little things. But what also really made an impact was those other pieces, like the electric company not coming and disconnecting people, the gas company, like those programs that gave people access to utilities, and you didn't have to worry about those getting shut off. The moratorium on eviction, and knowing that you weren't going to get thrown out on the street, so I want to say, yes, absolutely. I think there is value, and we should look at these other programs and make recommendations on some type of payment. And I just want to say, what really took the pressure and the stress off myself, and I'm an advocate that supports a lot of families in special education. So I work with a lot of rural families who also struggle with income a lot of times. And what really allowed people to be able to just breathe and feel safe was knowing that their basic needs were going to be met no matter what. And if on top of that, you could get a little bit ahead on your bills, great. But I just wanted to mention that. And also, I think there were a number of people, myself included, who, when we had that basic need kind of safety net there, we knew we weren't going to get evicted. We knew we didn't just blow the money on frivolous things, right? We weren't going on vacations and things. Like, a lot of people were making payments on those debts, those outstanding utilities, the car payments, and paying that down. So when they didn't have the money, or they were back to work and those programs weren't there to kind of catch them, they still had that room. So I absolutely agree, and just wanted to mention the value and the benefit of the combination of those two kind of resources.
Thanks so much, Katie. And yeah, I am someone who has spent a lot of time below the poverty level. Slowly gotten better, but the pandemic for my family was the first time in my life where I felt financially secure. who I don't have that anymore. So thanks so much for sharing those stories, Katie. Frank.
Cool. Thank you, Lee. And apologies if I missed this. I'm just curious if there's been any studies to kind of connect the implementation of these programs and the community benefits with kind of reductions in crime rates. And like whether kind of how law enforcement have engaged, and like if there have been law enforcement leaders who have kind of spoken out in support of this, because it's obviously hopefully kind of allowing them to focus on serious crime and not just criminalizing poverty or enforcing the criminalization of poverty.
Yeah, I think that's a really important nexus between prevention of crime and economic security. There are some really important pilots in Richmond, California, in Oakland, California. Pastor Mike McBride is one of the leaders of that body of work. There are a few organizations doing that, but not enough. So I think it's a place that needs more exploration. The data shows that it has a significant impact, especially cash transfers paired with other things like community ambassadors and other interventions.
And because is there a place where that research, or is it just kind of going to looking at that local level in California, or is there like a repository for that information right now that you're aware of?
I will get back to you on that, Representative McGill. Maybe I can email you some resources.
Yeah, I would. I know many of us would love whatever you've got. So
Great.
much appreciated.
All right, thank you.
Great presentation. Thank you. I think that, and I'm really glad you brought up the Alaska Permanent Fund, because that's sort of, I think, a really interesting use case here. And I think there is actually pretty good longitudinal data related to that, to Frank's question. And Alaska on a population basis isn't hugely dissimilar from Vermont. I think that my question goes back to what Senator Lyons had brought up, and really is, that was, the Alaska Fund is $60 or $70 billion, right? And all these things require very aggressive capitalization to fund, and so trying to think through that piece while answering some of the questions that the group has brought up for the benefit, just tremendously helpful. I think I think Alaska is actually a very interesting use case for sort of looking at that longitudinal data. I know that the pilot projects are incredibly interesting, but Stockton is, I think when I was just looking it up, right, it was 125 people in a community of 300,000. And so that has a slightly different impact, and it's hyper specific as opposed to the very generalized sort of impact that you're getting through the Alaska Permanent Fund. So I think that I'm glad you brought it up, and I hope that that's something that we might be able to look at.
Yeah, I think that's important. Alaska offers longitudinal data across both Democratic and Republican governorships. And the pilots are often much smaller, but I will argue that the pandemic also offers us a natural experiment around the country with the combination of checks we've talked about. And in the third place to be watching is in Flint, Michigan. There is a program there called RX Kids. It's launched by a pediatrician, Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. She was the pediatrician who rang the alarm bell on the Flint water crisis. Kids were coming into her clinic poisoned. And she operates in Flint. So they got through the water crisis, and kids were still, she realized the common thread of what is driving children into her clinic is poverty. And she wanted to do something about poverty. So she launched RX Kids, and every baby born in Flint will receive a check. The mother will receive a check for several years to come. There's also a prenatal lump sum payment to the mother, which all the studies show has a big impact on the racial disparities in maternal health, has a big impact on the health outcomes for the child if the mother has economic security. And so this will also be exciting because it's every baby born in Flint. And the way they capitalized it is by reappropriating the TANF dollars. So everybody eligible for TANF gets TANF dollars. And then the people who aren't receive philanthropic dollars. So it's a combination, and it's Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Lieutenant Governor Garland Gilchrist in Michigan have championed this. They've passed enabling legislation for the state to expand it to other cities in Michigan. So I think, and there's the talk of some federal legislation that would enable it federally too. So I think this is also a really interesting next generation of pilots that will give us, to your point about the differences in data, that will give us a different set of data because it's community wide. You know, so often we look at the impacts and they're individual, but we also know that when the individual is doing well, the community does well, that family structures do well, and family structures, no matter how we define them, right? In the widest expansive definition. And so I think that is also very important to understand the community impacts of economic stability.
You had a question?
I know you said you needed to leave.
For 7 minutes.
I very much appreciate you being here. One of the things that I really appreciated about your book was the conversation around trust in government and how we have an opportunity to change the narrative around how government can work for people who live here. And I'm curious if you can just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the trust in government is incredibly important to building a multiracial democracy that is possible for the first time on earth, right, in this country. But government has a really important role in that project, and people trusting government to be a force for good. It's important. And I think for so long, right, we've been told a narrative like government, the only way for the American economy to grow is for government to get out of the way. And we are now flipping that narrative on its head. You are doing that in the state. This administration is doing it federally, but it takes time. It takes time to beat back deeply seated old stories of government as something to be drowned in the bathtub, right? As famously said. So I think that's important. And I think things like direct file are a first step in that, right? When that teacher sat down to use a government tool. Now she could have gone to Intuit and paid $200 or H&R Block and paid $200 for somebody to tell the government exactly what the government already knows about her income. But this time she was able to use a free government tool, and in a very short amount of time, it was pre-populated with the data from last year's tax return, right? And so that is the type of thing that enables people to believe government can be a force for good. Do you have more you'd add to how we build out trust in government?
No, I appreciate that. I think a lot of your points around minimizing barriers to access are really important. Just a quick question around the pilots, because I think they often can be an opportunity to take a risk, as you talked about. I'm wondering, while people are participating in the pilots, are there opportunities to not take away other benefits that they have? Like when you talk about the Magnolia Trust Project, would folks who participated in $1,000 a month of additional income lose Reach Up and SNAP and other things? Or is there a way to sort of protect that income while you're trying out a new tool?
It's very state by state. So in every state where it's possible, we've passed waivers so that the checks from a pilot does not count as income and adversely impact people with existing benefits. But in states like in Mississippi, where the Magnolia Mothers Trust, one of the earliest pilots is, that is not possible. The state is actively hostile toward the pilot. So the mothers know exactly how it is going to impact each one of their benefits and can tell you down to the penny. From this $1,000, I will be getting 763 actual dollars in my pocket. Right. And anytime you sit with a mother who's low income, who's counting every penny to make sure her kid is fed, you are reminded that poor people know exactly how to handle their money. The challenge is they just don't have the money. And so I think it is very important to trust, to minimize friction, to give people money so they can be agents of their own financial lives.
Any other thoughts or questions for Natalie before she has to leave?
Thank you. You're very positive and very hopeful.
Well, that's not to minimize the problems we have, because they are very real and significant, but we just have to manage to hold the hope while battling the large, significant problems too. It is really my honor to be here with you. And you, Representative, have been just such a force for good in this state and in this storied state house. So thank you for having me. I'm truly honored.
Thank you. Okay, folks, I'm thinking, let's see. Why don't we break for lunch early? And then we will come back. Can people come back at 12:50 instead of 1? Okay, and then we'll do our scheduling for our next meetings before the end of 7. And then we'll be back.